All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the TCC Connect Campus series, Understanding the News. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to remind all of you not to hit the hand raise button unless you need help from one of our moderators. So tonight, moderating is going to be myself, Misty Wilson-Mertens, I'm the department chair, and one of our psychology instructors, Sherry Mata. If you have a question for the presenter, feel free to type it into the chat box. It's that little bubble button at the bottom. I'll keep track of the questions as you go, and Ms. Flowers can answer them at the end. Also, make sure you fill out the survey at the end because that's how you're going to get credit for coming tonight. It's really, really, really important. All right, so our speaker tonight is Allison Flowers. She's an investigative journalist who focuses on social justice and criminal justice. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Time, The Village Voice, Vice, The Chicago Reader, and she's been quoted in Newsweek, USA Today, Vox, ABC News, the New York Daily News, and the Christian Science Monitor. She's won several awards for her work, including the Hillman Foundation Sidney Award, the 2017 Eric Hoffer Book Award, and the Chicago Writers Association's Honorable Mention for Book of the Year in Nonfiction. Today, she's going to be talking to us about Exoneration Diaries, The Fight for Innocence, Independence, and Identity, her book. Allison, we're really grateful that you could be here tonight and that you're taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to share part of my evening with you, and thanks for being here, everyone. We can go ahead and tee up the presentation. Or am I supposed to do that, Misty? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So tonight we're going to learn about a subject that very few people know anything about, and that's why I decided to write a book on this topic. Many people know about wrongful convictions, of course. We have that in popular media such as Shawshank Redemption, or even literature like The Count of Monte Cristo. And it's a very classic story. You know, someone is convicted for something they didn't do, and then they prove their innocence and win their freedom, and it's a glorious underdog narrative. But that's typically where the story ends, and we don't hear a lot about what happens after an innocent person is released from prison. So in the next half hour or so, you're not only going to learn about these issues, but I'm also going to tell you about 4 exonerees. Antoine in the bottom right quadrant there, James Kluppelberg, bottom left, Jacques Rivera, upper right, and Christine Bunch. And these are the 4 exonerees that appear in my book. I'd actually like to start by reading a very short excerpt from my book about exoneree Jacques Rivera. He's in the upper right. He was wrongly convicted of a gang-related murder in Chicago on the eyewitness testimony of a 12-year-old boy who was pressured into identifying him in court. Before I read about Jacques, just a little by way of setup here, I'd like for you all to take a minute and visualize the last time that you did your laundry, okay? I did mine, I folded it on Monday. That's typically, my husband will cycle through it over the weekend and create a huge mountain of stuff for me to fold. And then I fold it on Monday evening while I watch really bad reality television. But for me, that's like the most pleasant way that I can clear through all the family laundry. And it's definitely multiplied since having a baby. But, you know, I think to most of us, you know, laundry is a burden, right? But one of my favorite parts in the book and in Jacques Rivera's story is when he returns home from prison after more than 20 years and does his own laundry. And for him, it's a very liberating experience. So this excerpt opens to his first morning home from prison. And the night before, he was so frightened by being home that he slept with a knife under his pillow. Okay, and this begins with him speaking. My troubles just began. You know, I appreciate my freedom. I appreciate justice, but my troubles are just beginning. You just can't throw someone into the wild and say, okay, make it. They just threw me back out into the wild and said, okay, you're on your own now. Jacques' mother, Gwendolyn, shared his sister's second-floor apartment with him. When she realized the butcher knife was missing from the kitchen, she asked him about it. I'm just scared, he told her. What are you scared of? He couldn't answer her, but he kept the knife, later moving it from his pillow to underneath the mattress with the knife handle protruding where it remains today. One of his only comforts, he discovered, was his sister Rose's French vanilla coffee with French vanilla creamer. She let him drink out of her red Disney coffee mug with a bird on it, a cup he later claimed as his own. The caption on the mug said something about a first cup of coffee. It wasn't Jacques' first cup of coffee, but it was his first cup of good coffee in more than 2 decades. He craved it after his release. That first morning, Rose made him a fresh cup. She served him some Lucky Charms, his favorite cereal. To Jacques, cereal had been a commodity in prison. It helped fill the gaps between meals, especially when inmates couldn't stomach the chow they were offered. Jacques hoarded boxes of cereals, stacking them up around his cell. They were his currency. Working in the kitchen, he also used to reserve taco meat and give extra to guys in return for what they wanted. A TV news team came to Rose's door. She called for Jacques. He let them in. They were eager to know how he was spending his first full day of freedom. Could they follow him? What was he eating for breakfast? Could they go upstairs and see his bed? No, I'm not going to show you that. Come on, Jacques told them, defensive and annoyed. What's your next move? They asked. Jacques was bewildered. He was busy contemplating that very question as friends and family poured in for visits. As his children sat before him, Jacques studied their faces. He stared at them, watching as their expressions and mannerisms shifted into new forms unknown to him. Years of poring over their photos in prison had failed to capture who they really were. Jacques felt the gravity of what he had missed. I was just looking at them, he says, weeping at the memory. How much they grew, how much they've changed. And skipping ahead just a bit. At home, Jacques sat on Rose's front porch. She watched him for a minute. What are you doing? Just sitting on the front porch, he said. Okay, she said, leaving him alone. Just sit on the front porch. For the first week or two, it was as far from home as he would go by himself. He stayed indoors, filling the time by watching sports on TV. Rose had to teach him how to use the remote control again. He was overwhelmed by the number of stations. It was literally like having an infant child, Rose says. Rose would ask him things like, you want to go to Subway? What's Subway? He would ask. Rose showed him her iPad. What's this? He asked. He touched the strange glossy screen. Everything was a tap of a finger away, but felt so foreign to Jacques. In a world where technology had created the illusion of ease during his long incarceration, everything seemed more difficult to navigate. His brother-in-law, an investor, helped him out financially, giving him $300 a month to live on. Jacques accepted the support on the condition that he would pay it back eventually. A family friend, his grade school sweetheart, who had long ago given him his first kiss, also gave him his first cell phone after his release. This is something you're going to need now that you're out, she told him. It was a simple phone at first, but a month or two later, she came by and upgraded him to an Android, having put him on her plan. A kind gesture given their history. After years of being his pen pal and love interest, she had visited him at Stateville Correctional Center after he earned his new trial. Excited about his possible release, Jacques told her to start getting a place ready for the two of them. That's when she broke the news that she was living with another guy. Jacques was crushed. He broke it off. Jacques continued to secure Rose's house, locking all the windows and doors around him. He felt like someone was watching him, like someone was coming after him. During his first few days home, Jacques was so troubled by what seemed like a lack of security and by the decisions and responsibilities of being a free man, that he was almost ready to go back to Stateville. I was comfortable. That was my home for 21 years, he says. Came at me too soon. It was all the hype. When Jacques finally ventured out on his own, he didn't go far, only to the laundromat a block away. In prison, he used to wash his underwear, t-shirts, and socks by hand. He would scrub them in the shower or in his cell because he didn't want them thrown in with everyone else's uniforms. At the laundromat, he put his dirty clothes in the washer. He had the whole machine to himself. As he added detergent and some coins, he stopped to take it all in. The simplicity of washing your own clothes, the magnitude of his newfound freedom. There was no going back. This was his new life. So he hit the start button and watched as the machine took off. So that's just a glimpse there at Jacques Rivera. So the word exoneree, which is what Jacques is, and the other three, and many other people, is until recently was not actually a word in the dictionary. It was added to Merriam-Webster, was the first to add it in February of 2017. My book came out in 2015. So at that time, I had found no dictionary that actually listed the word exoneree. And so every time I would type it out while I was writing the book, those little red squiggly lines would appear telling me that I had a misspelling, even though, you know, we had the word, of course, exoneration or exonerated, but no word for the person, no word for the growing community of people leaving prison innocent of the crimes that sent them there. Even though on average, there's an exoneration every 3 days in the US. And there have been more than 2,200 exonerations since 1989. That's more than 19,000 years lost behind bars. And that's not to mention the many people behind bars, of course, innocent, guilty, or as is the case in many cases, innocent but simply guilty of being poor and unable to afford a proper defense or bail themselves out of jail for something they did or didn't do. And that leads to a lot of plea bargains, as 90% of cases actually end in plea bargains. It's well known, of course, that the US locks up more people per capita than any other country in the world. And just this week, a Yale University professor who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, in his book, he writes that, you know, even though the United States represents 5% of the world's population, we represent almost 25% of the prison population. And, you know, we're not an especially violent people here in the US. And it's really because we're locking up people for nonviolent crimes and we're locking up people for crimes they didn't commit. The age of mass incarceration has taken many prisoners, not just the prisoners. It's the more than 2.3 million people that are held in thousands of state and federal prisons, jails, juvenile correctional facilities, military prisons, immigration detention centers, and so on. And it affects their families, their communities. It radiates outward to all of us as taxpaying citizens, whether we are particularly engaged or care about this issue or not. So with these massive criminal justice issues facing us, right, mass incarceration, wow, you know, why focus on the plight of innocent people and those who are exonerated? Well, from my point of view, and this picture, by the way, was recently taken at the Innocence Network conference that was held in Memphis this year. The man with the beard is Kirk Bloodsworth. He's the first death row DNA exoneree. And all the way to the right is Christine Bunch, the woman with the blonde hair. And she is the woman exoneree that I write about in my book that you saw earlier and that I'll be talking about later. But exonerees oops, this is a little bit ahead of things. Exonerees provide a point of entry into understanding our larger criminal justice failures as a country. Of course, they represent the underdog, and I have found that it's much easier to get people to care about the underdog and innocent people in prison more so than their brothers and sisters who are behind bars with them. And exonerees show us how the system is broken, or I would argue was designed to fail and only serve certain populations. Exonerees teach us about what failed them and what fails so many others. I'm not sure why my picture is overlapping there. It's a little wonky, but in Texas, there have been about 337, by my last count, from the exoneration registry, have been exonerated since 1989. And I know that Texas is a very big state, but that does represent about 15% of all U.S. exonerations. So, you know, more than their fair share. We want to see people exonerated, but there's also the concern that a lot of people are being wrongly convicted. Of these 337 people who've been exonerated in Texas, 60% of them are non-white. About half of them are for drug cases. So let that sink in. You know, majority non-white people being wrongly convicted in drug cases, okay? And we know that so many people are behind bars for the nonviolent crime of drugs. So They represent about 1,900 years lost behind bars, or about 10% of that of the country, of the whole country. I want to talk a little bit about how wrongful convictions happen. The leading contributing factor of wrongful convictions, and we see this in more than half of all exonerations nationwide, is lying about someone, or perjury, or a false accusation. So getting on the stand and basically lying about someone else in court. And this is the primary reason that people are locked up. The second is mistaken eyewitness identification. That accounts for about a third of all exonerations. And it's very hard because eyewitness identification, while it is very complicated and questionable, is among the strongest evidence in court. There's nothing more powerful than seeing someone say, I saw this happen, and he's the guy who did it, and pointing to that person, right? So that's extremely powerful testimony, and it leads to a lot of convictions. False confessions is another contributing factor, and this is basically admitting to something that you didn't do. And how could this happen, right? It contributes to about 13% of cases. Now, before you think that you would never confess to something that you didn't do, I would suggest you try fasting, abstaining from using the bathroom, and getting no sleep for 12 hours, 24 hours, sometimes even more. And let's see if you would crack in an interrogation. And in an attempt to kind of make it all go away, sometimes promises are made, like, if you just say this, you can go home. Then that is how false confessions and often wrongful convictions happen. False or misleading forensic evidence contributes to about a quarter of exonerations where there's been a wrongful conviction. We also call this bad science. An example would be arson. A lot of arson cases, bite mark evidence cases, the science behind that has evolved and has been very flawed in the past. Our understanding has grown, and this has led to a lot of exonerations. Finally, official misconduct. And what I mean by that is clear wrongdoing by police or prosecutors has contributed to more than half of cases. So it's actually the second leading contributing factor to wrongful convictions. And in Chicago, where I live, it's even higher. Almost 80% of the exonerations we've had here had official misconduct as a contributing factor. We also know that about 97% of all of our police disciplinary complaints go without consequence. So there's definitely a strong element of official misconduct driving wrongful convictions where I live. Now, I decided to delve into these issues about 4 years ago when I was working as a journalist at the Medill Justice Project at Northwestern University. And I had spent time, as you can see on the left, where I'm holding the microphone and my reporter notebook, I had spent time on crime and court stories working in TV in Georgia, and that led to my interest in investigating wrongful convictions. And when I wasn't in the field, I had a basement office where, in an academic building on campus, where I explored criminal justice issues. The woman that you see on the right is a woman whose case I helped investigate, and she was released a few years later. Now, I realized something while I was working this job investigating wrongful convictions. I was preparing to head into work one day, and I said to myself, we're doing all this work to uncover the truth and perhaps free innocent people from prison, but what happens when those innocent people, like Jennifer Delpreet right here, what happens when they're freed? And that's really the central question of my book, is what happens after? And what I discovered was a media myth that release from prison is a happy ending. And it's not an ending at all, actually. It's the beginning of another set of struggles altogether. So when you walk out of prison as an exoneree, you receive no immediate compensation. You don't have a dime, basically. You don't even get a bus pass. There are no social services, no counseling, no medical, and your record is not automatically expunged. So you can't find work very easily, and sometimes you can't ever find work. Some of your family members may have died. Your spouse probably divorced you a long time ago. especially in longer incarcerations, and your children may be estranged from you. They may not know who you are. Depending on where you were convicted, the state may or may not compensate you. Right now, only 32 states have laws to provide compensation, and most of the states that do compensate don't provide much at all. In Illinois, where I live, the most that you can get, regardless of how long you were in prison, I think the longest serving exoneree in Illinois is almost 40 years, but the most that you can get by way of compensation is $200,000. Now in Texas, and this is something to be proud of, Texas actually has the most generous compensation law for exonerees in the entire country. And that's actually because a group of exonerees helped craft the law. And they took the matter into their own hands. So in Texas, exonerees receive about $80,000 per year of wrongful incarceration, and then they get some sort of annuity on top of that. They get $10,000 for reintegration financial assistance. Attorney's fees are covered, lost wages are covered. Other recompense can include a year's worth of counseling and some tuition up to, I think, 120 credit hours. But there's a but, right? Here's the catch. Sorry, this is covered up. I don't know why my presentation did that. It says the fine print. Sorry, spoiler. In Texas, proving innocence, it's a very high bar, and you have to have a full pardon. Now, you might think, well, what's wrong with that? Shouldn't you have a full pardon in order to receive all of that money, right? But the thing is, putting the onus on exonerees to prove their own innocence in a new proceeding is difficult. Proving innocence is very hard. It's very different than proving guilt in the first place or not guilty, right? Which is the original standard of proof in when you were at trial. So proving innocence, here's why it's difficult. The passage of time means that evidence has been destroyed, and people who could have testified may have died. And so the people and the evidence that you need to clear you and to prove your innocence, by virtue of you being incarcerated wrongly for sometimes decades, that evidence is now unavailable to you. So how do you prove your innocence, right? And also, this entire process requires the help of a lawyer. You can't do it on your own. And so it means that it's not a fast and easy process. The legal standard is that there must be a preponderance of evidence. That's pretty common in most states. So overwhelming evidence proving your innocence. And the exoneree must have sought compensation no later than the 3rd anniversary from their case being overturned. So that, again, puts the onus on the exoneree in Texas to know that such a process exists that they need to pursue for compensation when they're just trying to adjust to life on the outside. A lot of people say, well, why not just sue the police or the city because they're the ones that wrongly convicted you, or the county or whatever. The thing is, suing the city or police department successfully is actually pretty rare. And even though I'm sure you've read about multi-million-dollar lawsuits and things like that, they're on the news because they're rare, right? They're unusual news events. So very few cases are well suited for this type of civil litigation, and proving official misconduct, even though it's present in more than half of exonerations nationwide, is very difficult. Okay, let's go back to the exonerees that I was telling you about. Given all these obstacles that I just laid out for you, it was really important for me to put a name and a face to the exoneree experience for these people who, until very recently, didn't even have a word to describe them. So let me tell you a little bit about who they are. We've talked about Jacques Rivera, upper right. He's a former gang member who was mistakenly identified on a murder charge by a 12-year-old boy. This boy witnessed a family friend's shooting from across the street. So he was hidden in an alcove. He was just buying some candy at the local store, and while he was walking back home, he saw this terrible shooting happen. And he was pressured into identifying Jacques in a lineup and later in court. This misidentification haunted him for more than 20 years, and he eventually recanted his testimony in court, and that helped win Jacques his freedom. But when Jacques was released from prison, he experienced extreme paranoia, symptoms of PTSD. And he feared that the police detective who originally targeted him, an infamous detective whose name is Reynaldo Guevara, he feared that Detective Guevara was going to hunt him down and shoot him in the back. And so he couldn't sleep at night. He couldn't go on buses. He was overwhelmed. But, my question is, was that even paranoid? Because this detective has since been tied to beating confessions out of suspects, and he is now linked to a dozen murder convictions that have been overturned, and there are another 50 or so cases, questionable cases, that he investigated that led to convictions that are highly suspect. Bottom right is Antoine Day. He was a musician who was set up on a murder charge and convicted through perjury. So someone lied about him in court, rumors circulating throughout his neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. And what happened in Antoine's case, which happens in a lot of cases, is that when he earned his freedom and his case was overturned, there was no notice or media attention whatsoever. He didn't know it was going to happen. His mother wasn't even in the courtroom in that, victorious moment. It was very perfunctory, and he didn't know what was coming. So that meant he didn't even have, his own clothes on his back when he left the Cook County Jail, which is where he was awaiting a new trial when his case was overturned. So he had to pluck some dirty garments from a pile in the jail intake area so that he could leave the jail with clothes on his back. James Kluppelberg is the man on the bottom left, and he actually helped pass a law in Illinois to help exonerees get paid. He was a handyman in the 80s who was wrongly convicted on a false accusation. So again, someone lying in court, and also fabricated arson evidence and bad science in a fire that killed an entire family of 6. I shouldn't say entire family, the husband did survive. But it killed 6 people in that family. And as a result, he was serving 6 life sentences. He did evade the death penalty, but he was serving 6 life sentences before he was released after a quarter of a century behind bars. So when he was released, his lawyers were looking into halfway houses for him without any luck because they wouldn't take him. And when that's when James's estranged son actually reconnected with him after seeing him on the news because of the attention in his case. And so he went to live with his son, and his granddaughters, whom he had never met, gave up their bed for him. It actually had pink Tinkerbell sheets on it, and that's where he lived for the first year or so after he was out. So had his family, estranged family, I should say, not tracked him down, he would have been homeless. And lastly, Christine Bunch in the upper left. She's a single mother who was wrongly convicted of killing her own 3-year-old son, Tony. He died in an accidental trailer fire at her home in Indiana. And when Christine was first interrogated, she was at the hospital hours after Tony's death, and her hair was singed from the fire, her nose was blistered, she was coughing up black phlegm, and that's when investigators tape recorded her in that, terrible, traumatic moment. After she was released from the hospital, they weren't done with her. She actually had to walk barefoot to the sheriff's office again. She had lost everything in the fire, so she had no shoes. And she was convicted on falsified arson evidence and bad science. And what I mean by falsified arson evidence, they tested samples from her trailer and had samples that were positive or negative for accelerants. Accelerants are found in a lot of our common materials, so the presence of an accelerant isn't necessarily indicative of guilt. But what they did was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that was doing the testing, a federal agency, changed the negative samples in her case to positive to make her look guilty. And we don't know why. We know why they did it, but we don't know who did it specifically or how the evidence got in that case. But we do know that the samples were negative and they were crossed through and handwritten to say positive. She entered prison pregnant actually with another son, okay? So she had to have a baby in prison and give him up. Her mother raised that son. So imagine for Christine, when she's lost one son, right? She's being deprived of the opportunity to raise her other son. And when she leaves prison 17 years later, after, earning her freedom and her case is overturned and she's proclaimed innocent, her second son is grown. And she tries to reconnect with him while figuring out what to do with her own life. And it's all, extremely difficult. And I'd like to take the moment to talk about women exonerees, okay? These are all women exonerees that you see in this photo here. They're not all the women exonerees in the country, but they are the women exonerees that I've met and that were at a conference a couple of years ago. Christine is in the upper right quadrant there. Women exonerees face a unique set of challenges. So more than 40% of them are convicted of harming or killing a loved one under their care. And, women often being the caretakers in many family situations and in life or as jobs, when someone is hurt or when someone falls ill, often they're the only adult around to accuse, right? And that is manifest by the fact that in 2/3 of these cases where women are convicted, wrongly convicted, I should say, there was actually no crime at all. It was an accident, or someone had a medical issue that hit the fan on their watch. So these are often accidents. And it's probably not surprising that false or misleading evidence, forensic evidence, I should say, bad science, leads to a lot of wrongful convictions. Sexism is very present in the criminal justice system as women go through the system. It really lurks at every stage of a woman's case from the moment that they're interrogated and on. There is a manual called the Reed Manual that is used by many law enforcement agencies to try and garner a confession. And this is, it's called the Reed method or the Reed technique. It's like a step-by-step way to get someone to confess to a crime. And it can be used on men or women, but the Reed Manual gives a very specific instruction that women cry to manipulate investigators, and that they're only doing this to as a final yet insincere effort to gain sympathy. So in Christine's case, she obviously was very broken over her son's death and, has been fully declared innocent of that. So, when she was being interrogated, if she cried, it was because she just lost her son, not because she's guilty or trying to gain sympathy. And the judge at her trial actually accused her of becoming pregnant in order to gain sympathy from the jury, which is, an extremely sexist notion. So I'm going to read a section from Christine's part of the book to close out. Before I do, I'd like to say this. I would not be the same person without these exonerees. That's me. I'm 7 months pregnant in that photo. This is at my book launch event. That's Christine on the left, Antoine, James, and Jacques. And, during my years working on this book, I was struck by the passage of time, the events of my own life, and just how privileged I was. During the time I was writing the book, I was able to change jobs twice because I wanted to. I took a trip with my family to celebrate my dad's retirement. I took time off from my regular job to write the book. I got married. I went to my grandmother's funeral, right? I became pregnant with my son. And for exonerees and others languishing in prison as well, they miss out on these moments and these milestones. Antoine couldn't attend his own son's funeral. His son died while he was incarcerated. James didn't get to bury his mother or properly say goodbye. Christine, as I mentioned, was robbed of the chance to grieve her son's death because, within days of his death, she was arrested and charged with his murder. And she missed out on raising her other son and being around for those milestones, like him taking his first steps. Jacques didn't get to see his kids graduate. And, they tell me that holidays, for example, like Thanksgiving or Christmas, now that they're free on the outside, just have completely lost their luster and they can't get excited about them because on the inside, they're pretty much just like any other day, except, nothing special about them except maybe in their grimness and in your separation from your family. So exonerees have taught me a lot about bitterness. There's no loss greater than losing your life for something that you didn't do or being blamed for the death of your own child. So when you have nothing left, hope is what helps you survive. And that's what helped this group of exonerees survive. And they've learned that anger definitely sets them back. And of course, I've seen them express anger and frustration. I've known them for close to 6 or 7 years now, but ultimately they're determined not to waste the years they have left on bitterness. So 2 things before we close, and I read a little bit of Christine's section of the book, an excerpt. 2 things I want you to remember. Exonerees are ordinary people, just like you and me. I think that comes across in the photo here. And, wrongful convictions can and do happen to anyone. Christine didn't even have a parking ticket to her name when she was wrongly convicted. And exonerees are also, though, and please remember this, extraordinary people. They beat remarkable odds to be here and to share their stories with me and with you. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot to Christine's excerpt. And I'm actually seeing Christine tomorrow evening. There's a play performance here in town at a major theater in Chicago, and it's about a woman exoneree. And Christine's organization that she started is hosting the event. So I'm excited to see her tomorrow. So I'll close out with this short section. This is picking up when Christine is leaving the Decatur County Jail in Indiana, where she was being held. A plastic bag with her name on it held a purple and blue striped frock, dress shoes, and some tan-colored pantyhose. Christine's mother, Susan, had managed to get these items into the hands of a deputy inside the jail, where she was preparing to leave. Christine chucked the nylon pantyhose. No way was I going to wear that. That was another prison, she says. But she conceded and put on the horrible, ugly dress from her mother. Clutching the plastic bag and some paper, she walked out into the sunshine. Another batch of reporters greeted her. After years of running file photos and old video on her case, the news crews ate up the chance to capture fresh footage of Christine, hugging her mother and the lawyers who had helped her. Christine smiled and pivoted to answer their questions. Once I'm fully cleared, I'm going to law school, she told them, garnering claps from her supporters. Christine had worked in the prison law library for several years, becoming a paralegal and helping other women with their cases. She was one of the first inmates at Indiana Women's Prison to take the LSAT. She had done much of her own legal work in prison, sending ideas and tips to her local attorney. You seem so happy, one reporter noted. It would seem like you might be tempted to be bitter about waiting this long to get out, but you don't seem to show that. Can you explain that? Christine turned to him mid-question and her face dropped. I think because this entire time I haven't been by myself, she answered. I've had a family that has stood by me. I've had people that believed in me and stepped up. And you can't receive blessings like that and be bitter. Away from the reporters, her teenage son Trent was a little standoffish. His striped polo shirt hung on his frame. His wavy hair was cut into the shaggy, swoop style of teen pop star Justin Bieber, and Trent was now several inches taller than Christine, at about 5'7". He gave her a hug, but said nothing. Maybe it's something that happens with boys, Christine thought. They don't want to be hugged and kissed. Plus, she understood that her legal victory could only be a temporary reprieve from the difficult life he had known. A retrial could snatch Christine back into captivity. Still, Trent posed with his family for a photo, arms linked, flashing a wide camera smile frozen in time. At a bistro in nearby Columbus, Indiana, Christine ordered a glass of champagne, scallops, not on the menu, but made specially by the restaurant for her first night free, and some peach ice cream. As she sipped her champagne, a TV camera captured footage around the table of Christine breaking bread with her lawyers and family. It was a quiet, pensive ride back to her mother's apartment where her son had been living. This would be her home, too. Christine walked through the door and stopped. To her shock, the space was packed, with only small pathways of linoleum separating the junk. There was garbage strewn about. Cigarette smoke had yellowed the walls. During her years in prison, Trent had never mentioned these conditions. The disorder hung in stark contrast to the orderliness of prison, though both settings concealed a certain chaos. Something broke in her, Christine says. attributing her mother's hoarding behavior to the pain of losing her daughter for 17 years. She clings to what she can, Christine reasons. Now she can't seem to clean or throw things away. Inside, everyone else went to bed. Christine didn't know what to do. She didn't have a toothbrush or pajamas or a place to sleep. She took off her dress, changed back into her beige prison uniform, and cleared off a space on a recliner. Then Christine got back up. She went to Trent, who was conked out in his bed. She watched her son closely. He was almost a grown man. For hours, Christine stayed awake. She says, "I always wanted to check on my baby as he slept." Okay, thank you very much. That concludes my lecture, and I would be happy to take any questions. I'm going to go ahead and put up my contact information.
Hi. So, Allison, we've actually got quite a few questions here. I know you can't answer this specifically, but maybe ballpark. How many wrongful convictions do you think happen every year?
Yeah, and exactly, nail on the head. It's hard to say, right? We don't have a way of knowing that. There have been some studies that attempt to answer this question, although it can't be definitive. But I think the estimate is that about 5 to 10% of all convictions are wrongful convictions, and a study a couple of years ago showed that I think approximately 4% of death row prisoners are likely innocent. I may not have that exact figure correct, but it's in the like 3 to 4% range. Now, I've spoken to many prisoners over the years. I'm actually headed to a prison tomorrow to interview a young, well, he's not young anymore, he's been in prison for 18 years, but a man who may be wrongly convicted. And they will say, people in prison, and especially people who've been exonerated, will say that they believe the number is much higher, something closer to about 20%. So 1 in 5 prisoners, according to exonerees that I've talked to informally over the years, would say that about 20% of prisoners are wrongly convicted.
That's unfortunate, Allison. This is Sherry Mata. I teach psychology for TCC Connect. And another student asked a question, which state would actually pay the wrongful conviction, I guess, reimbursements if to an exoneree if they lived in, say, Texas, but they were arrested and transported to another state like Oklahoma for their case?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you were convicted by the state, then you would be eligible for the $80,000 a year that Texas gives you and all the other stuff I mentioned. And again, you would have to prove your innocence to the court, and the state's attorney would have to agree, and it's a difficult process. But if this person is a Texas resident and yet they served time or were transported to Oklahoma, that tells me that it was likely a federal case, and the federal compensation statute is different and not nearly as generous as Texas. I don't know the exact figure, but it's a separate process entirely and definitely not as generous as the Texas statute.
I see. Thank you.
So another question we had here was about the pressure on police. Are police pressured to find these people or to get these convictions, or is this just overzealousness?
I think it could be a little bit of both. I certainly don't think that it's misconduct driving all the cases. There is definitely pressure to close cases, and police are criticized for low clearance rates across the country. So there's definitely pressure to solve cases, to give families a sense of justice. Of course, it's such an injustice to a family for them to think that one person was guilty when in fact that person is innocent, and then have the true perpetrator living without consequence, and out there with the ability to harm other people. So I do think that it is a bit of overzealousness and the pressure to solve cases as well. There's also a lot of gamesmanship that goes into it. And I'm speaking more of prosecutors here, but prosecutors there's a lot of prosecutorial misconduct to be concerned with, and not as many consequences for prosecutors who don't disclose evidence of innocence to attorneys. That's called a Brady violation, and when it happens, it can that can be used to help overturn a case and help get someone out of prison. But there aren't very consistent or clear consequences for prosecutors who withhold evidence of innocence that could clear a defendant. And I think, winning cases gets you further along in your career. And so I think many times people are not concerned with getting it right. They're just concerned with winning cases. And then on top of that, there is some misconduct. I won't even say some. There's a lot of misconduct that drives these cases where there's a disregard for lives, especially people of color.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. This is Sherry Mata again. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with our students. And I was curious from a psychological standpoint. I could just see this entire population of exonerees experiencing a multitude of mental health issues such as PTSD, depression, complicated grief, anxieties, different, the whole array of disorders. Have you seen much research on what these exonerees experience mental health-wise after the fact?
I have not seen any research, and anything known about exonerees, it's such a new field because the wrongful conviction movement is actually pretty new. It's only been over the last 20, 30 years that we've become so aware that wrongful convictions happen. DNA evidence really opened our eyes to the fact that so many people were innocent with very concrete evidence of innocence, exonerating them. So even tracking exonerees and being able to study their cases and see the contributing factors among them, that is all so recent, just in the last 5 or so years. And so, when I was writing this book, there was really nothing out there about exonerees. Shortly after, or right before I published the book, Making a Murderer came out, which shows one exoneree and the very unfortunate path his life took after he was released from a crime he was definitely innocent of. His original conviction, he was absolutely innocent of that crime. And then people disagree about whether he is guilty of the next thing he's been charged with on the outside. So I think, speculatively, yes, of course, I would say, exonerees experience many mental health issues upon release, as any prisoner would. And there are not counseling services afforded to them immediately afterwards. Some cases have that written into the compensation statute, so for them to receive that. But here in Illinois, even though we have that as part of the statute, the exonerees I have talked to who have received compensation and should be eligible for counseling have not received that from the state, and that has not happened. That promise has not happened. So it's a huge, huge gap.
Seems to be so. I know that here in Texas, in our immediate area, and I guess this might be for student knowledge too, if students may be interested in this area, we have what we call the Innocence Project. Are you familiar with that, Allison?
The Innocence Project? Yes, I used to work for an Innocence Project.
Can you share some of your experience with students on that?
Yes, I worked for the Medill Innocence Project. It later changed its name to the Medill Justice Project. I worked there in 2011 to 2013. That project was a little different than most innocence projects today. It was one of the founding projects in the entire network, but it was a journalism-based project. So we had, no legal power to represent these people, but we were able to investigate their cases and try to uncover new evidence that might be helpful in their case and publish stories about it so that, that public information would be available to them or to any lawyer representing them. And so I had shown a picture of Jennifer Del Preet, a woman who was exonerated. She was accused of killing an infant under her care. She was a daycare worker, home daycare worker, and I helped investigate her case. And the evidence we found in her case that helped exonerate her was an email between the police detective and the child abuse medical expert at the hospital that had cared for the infant before she died. And it basically showed a level of collusion between them to try and persuade the medical examiner to change what they thought would be his opinion of the case, because this particular medical examiner had typically ruled in favor of the defense in these cases where an infant had died on a suspected shaken baby syndrome. You may have heard of shaken baby syndrome or seen the PSAs about that. Shaken baby syndrome, it's been a problematic medical diagnosis that has led to a lot of wrongful convictions. Certainly children are abused and infants are abused in this way, but when a baby shows shaken baby syndrome, typically there is head trauma associated with it, so not just shaking but a blow to the head. Not to be overly technical about this, and I guess I should have provided a trigger warning, but only shaking a baby without any other impact, those diagnoses and those convictions, which again falls a lot to women, to daycare workers, moms, caretakers, those have come under scrutiny because the understanding of the science has changed, and it's been shown that you can't produce the force to cause that sort of injury. And so it can normally what's at cause was earlier head trauma from a fall that hit the fan a few days later on somebody's watch, or an underlying medical condition that's unknown, or sometimes known, but that's generally unknown to the person, that manifests itself in ways that mimic what's known as shaken baby syndrome. So those were the cases that I worked on, as well as a couple of other murder cases that I reinvestigated. And I continue to reinvestigate about one case at a time among some other projects. So the Innocence Network is now comprised of legal clinics. No longer journalism projects are part of the network. They've kind of set out on their own for different reasons. We do very different things, journalists and lawyers, so it's understandable. But there are about 80 or so law-based innocence projects across the country that try to represent people on the basis of actual innocence, which typically means like wasn't there, didn't do it, not me type stuff.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Not legal technicalities. Sure. I know here in our area, Texas Christian University, University of North Texas, UTA in Arlington, and Texas A&M Law School at Texas Wesleyan's campus. They all four collaborate. The students in the law programs collaborate on innocence projects here locally, just in case any of our students are interested in that field.
Yes, they do really good work.
Do we have any other students that have any questions? We've got about 6 minutes left in the session, and remember to be considered present for this webinar, this live webinar. You must follow the link that Misty Wilson just sent out to complete the survey. Okay, well, we really appreciate our students who took the time out of their schedule to attend this webinar on exonerees, and we certainly appreciate Allison Flowers for sharing her experiences and her knowledge and information about her book, The Fight for Innocence, Independence, and Identity. Misty, is there anything that you'd like to add?
just thank you so much, Allison, for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me and for taking a chance on a little-known subject. And I hope you all feel informed about this injustice and can tell others about it. So thank you so much for joining me this evening.
You're welcome. We had a student just comment that this was some very eye-opening information. So I believe that our students also are going to walk away from this webinar with additional knowledge. So thank you again.
Great.